A delicate swirl of foundation brushes across her flawless skin, expertly applied by her own hand. In the mirror, the face staring back is one that the world envies. A face she has sculpted through years of practice, hiding the truth beneath layers of beauty. Elena Bresson, one of the most sought-after makeup artists in the city, lives in a world of luxury, surrounded by wealth and fame, yet no one really knows who she is or where she came from. It wasn't always like this. The morning sun filters through the tall windows of her penthouse, casting a golden hue on the marble floors. She sits at her vanity, lost in thought. Her hand trembles for a moment as she applies her signature red lipstick, a color so bold it's almost defiant. It's a reminder of her strength, of the journey she has taken to get here. She recalls the day she left her father's mansion, fleeing in the dead of night with nothing but her mother's love and a small suitcase. Her father, Jacques Bresson, a real estate tycoon worth billions, had always been a cold, controlling man. But when she told him who she really was, when she revealed the truth about herself, everything changed. She was only 7 when she realized she was different. It wasn't just about being born into privilege, it was about her identity. She knew in her heart she was meant to be a girl, not the son her father had so proudly claimed as his heir. Her mother, Camille, had been her only support in a world that didn't understand her. But Jacques? He refused to accept it. He saw her as a threat to his reputation, to his legacy. The violence in their home escalated quickly after that revelation. Elena clenches her jaw, remembering how her father's hand had struck her mother that final night. She had run to protect Camille, but it was too late. Jacques had screamed at them, calling her an abomination, threatening to end her life. That was the moment she knew she had to leave. The next morning, she was gone. Now, years later, she has returned, but not as the helpless child who had once fled. She is a woman, powerful and poised, her life meticulously crafted to hide the pain beneath. She has spent years perfecting her craft, becoming the best makeup artist in Europe, and using her position to infiltrate the upper echelons of society. Behind the glamorous exterior, though, is a deep, burning desire for revenge. Her return to Paris had been calculated. Elena had married a wealthy financier, Philippe Durand, a man who adored her and supported her ambitions, giving her the means to exact her revenge. Philippe knew nothing of her past, of the abuse she had endured or the bloodline she carried. To him, she was simply the captivating, mysterious woman he loved, unaware of the secrets she hid even from him. Now sitting at her vanity, she is no longer Elena Bresson, the makeup artist. She is Elena, the daughter of a fallen queen, and she is ready to reclaim her crown. Her phone buzzes beside her. A text message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. I know who you are." Her heart skips a beat. It couldn't be him. Not now. Not when everything was finally falling into place. Elena rises, her eyes narrowing at the screen. She glances around the room, paranoia seeping in. For years, she has kept her identity hidden, using makeup not just as a tool of her trade, but as a shield to mask her true self. She had been careful, so very careful. Yet, here it was, someone new. She quickly dresses, slipping into a sleek black dress that hugs her figure. Her movements are fluid, deliberate, every action a part of her carefully constructed persona. She checks her reflection once more, ensuring that every hair, every line is perfectly in place before heading out. The streets of Paris are alive with the hum of the city, the lights reflecting off the Seine as the evening settles in. She walks quickly, heels clicking against the pavement, her mind racing. The text had said to meet at a small cafe near the river, a place she used to frequent as a child with her mother. The irony is not lost on her. As she approaches the cafe, her gaze shifts through the crowd, scanning the faces of strangers. And then she sees him. A man sitting alone at a corner table, a familiar face from the past. It's not her father, but someone much worse. Antoine Leclerc, her father's right-hand man and the one responsible for her mother's death. Her pulse quickens, but she forces herself to remain calm. This is what she came back for. This moment. Antoine looks up as she approaches, a sly smile curling on his lips. "You've grown up," he says, his voice smooth yet dripping with malice. "I almost didn't recognize you, Elena." "I doubt that," she replies coldly, taking a seat across from him. Her hands rest calmly on the table, but her mind is calculating, assessing the situation. She knows he wouldn't have come without a reason. Antoine always had an agenda. I see you've done well for yourself, he continues, glancing at her expensive dress and jewelry. But then again, you always had a way of getting what you wanted. Elena's eyes narrow. What do you want, Antoine? He leans forward, lowering his voice. Your father is dying. The words hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Elena feels a surge of emotions, anger, relief, confusion, but she keeps her expression unreadable. I thought you should know, Antoine says, leaning back in his chair. He doesn't have much time left, and he's been asking for you. Elena's heart races. After all these years, her father wants to see her? But why? And more importantly, what does he know? Antoine smirks, clearly enjoying her discomfort. He's still the same cruel bastard, though. Don't think he's changed. I'm not interested in seeing him, she replies, though the lie tastes bitter in her mouth. Antoine shrugs. Suit yourself, but you should be prepared. He's not going to die without a fight, and he's left instructions. Elena raises an eyebrow. Instructions? He's named you as his successor, Antoine says, watching her reaction closely. You inherit everything. The world seems to spin for a moment. Elena had spent her whole life trying to escape her father, his influence, his cruelty. And now, just as she is about to achieve the revenge she's worked so hard for, he throws her a curveball. You'll have to come back, Antoine adds, his voice like poison. Whether you like it or not. Elena's eyes darken, and for the first time in years, she feels the cold grip of fear. She had come back to destroy her father's empire, not inherit it. But now it seems fate has other plans. Elena left the cafe with her mind in turmoil, the weight of Antoine's words pressing down on her. Her father, Jacques Bresson, the man who had tormented her and her mother for years, was dying, and he had chosen her, the very child he had rejected, as his successor. It was a twisted joke, a final act of cruelty from a man who seemed determined to haunt her even from his deathbed. The cool evening breeze swept through the streets of Paris, but Elena barely noticed. Her thoughts swirled like the river beside her, dark and churning with emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She had been preparing for this day, planning her revenge against the people who had wronged her mother. And yet, this unexpected turn left her vulnerable. As she walked, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Philippe, her husband, asking if she'd be home for dinner. She stared at the screen for a moment, then quickly typed a reply. Running late. Don't wait up. She couldn't face him right now, not when everything she thought she knew was beginning to unravel. Instead of going home, Elena found herself standing outside a tall, ornate building in one of the wealthiest parts of Paris. The Bresson mansion. She hadn't been here in years, but the memories came flooding back as she stared up at the towering gates. This was the place where she had spent her childhood, where her mother had tried to protect her, and where her father had tried to erase her existence. The house had changed little, still standing as a symbol of wealth and power, but to Elena, it was nothing more than a gilded prison. She felt a surge of anger rise within her, and with it, a sense of purpose. She hadn't come back to reclaim her father's empire. She had come back to destroy it. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the gate and made her way to the front door. The staff must have been expecting her because the door swung open before she even had the chance to knock. Miss Bresson, the butler greeted her, his voice polite but devoid of warmth. Your father is in the study. Elena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't seen Jacques in nearly a decade, not since the night she had fled. The thought of facing him again filled her with a mixture of dread and determination. She had to know what his game was, why he had chosen her as his successor after all this time. As she entered the mansion, the air inside felt thick with history, oppressive, heavy with memories she wished she could forget. The grand staircase loomed before her, but she ignored it, heading straight for the study at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the faint sound of labored breathing from within. Pushing the door open, Elena stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn to block out the fading sunlight. Her father sat in a large leather chair, his once imposing frame now frail and shrunken with age. His face, once so harsh and unforgiving, was now gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken into his skull. For a moment, he didn't seem to notice her. His breathing was shallow, raspy, and his eyes were fixed on the fire burning in the hearth. But then, slowly, he turned his head and met her gaze. "Elena," he rasped, his voice weak but still carrying that familiar edge of disdain. "You've come." She stood in the doorway, her hands clenched at her sides. Every part of her wanted to turn around and leave, to walk away from this man who had caused her so much pain. But she couldn't. Not yet. "I had to see for myself," she said, her voice cold. "I had to see if it was true." Jacques chuckled, a low, bitter sound. "You never were one to believe in rumors." Elena took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "Why me?" she demanded. "Why now?" Her father's smile faded, and for a moment, he looked almost vulnerable. Almost. "You're my heir, Elena. My blood. No matter what you think of me, you can't deny that." "I'm not your heir," she snapped. "I stopped being your child the day you tried to kill me." Jacques didn't respond right away. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You were always strong, Elena. Stronger than I gave you credit for. But strength alone won't save you." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, stepping closer to his chair. He let out a shaky breath. "I've made enemies, Elena. Powerful enemies. They'll come for you now, just as they came for me." Elena felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to let him see her fear. "I'm not afraid of your enemies." "You should be," Jacques replied, his eyes darkening. "They're not like the people you've dealt with before. They don't care about money or power. They only care about blood." For a moment, Elena didn't know how to respond. She had come here expecting a confrontation, a final battle with the man who had tried to destroy her life. But instead, she found herself facing something far more sinister. "They'll come for you too," Jacques continued, his voice growing weaker with each word. "And when they do, you'll have to decide whether you want to inherit my empire or burn it to the ground." Elena's heart raced as she stared at him, trying to make sense of his words. Could it be true? Had her father's enemies already set their sights on her? Or was this just another manipulation, a final attempt to control her from beyond the grave? "I don't want your empire," she said through gritted teeth. "I came here for one reason, to make sure you suffer the way you made my mother suffer." Jacques chuckled again, though the sound was weaker this time. Revenge won't bring her back. "I know that," Elena replied, her voice hardening. "But it will make sure you don't get to die peacefully." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving her father to his fate. But as she stepped out into the hallway, her mind was racing. Jacques had always been a cruel, manipulative man. But what if he was telling the truth? What if the enemies he had made were already closing in on her? As she left the mansion, the weight of her father's words hung heavy on her shoulders. She had come back to Paris to settle old scores, but now it seemed there was much more at stake. Her father's empire, his enemies, and the dark legacy he had left behind, all of it was now hers to deal with. And whether she liked it or not, the game had only just begun. The cool night air hit Elena's face as she stepped out of the Bresson mansion, but the relief it brought was short-lived. Her father's words echoed in her mind, unsettling her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had expected confrontation, a final exchange of hateful words with the man who had ruined her life. Instead, Jacques had left her with a mystery. Enemies she didn't know existed, threats that seemed larger than the personal vendetta she had carried for years. She hurried down the streets of Paris, the city lights blurring in her peripheral vision as her heels clicked against the pavement. There was a sharpness to the night, the streets darker than usual, and her senses were heightened. Jacques had warned her that the people he had crossed would come for her next. Who were they? What did they want? The questions gnawed at her, but her resolve hardened with each step. She wouldn't let her father's ghosts haunt her. She had her own plans. By the time she reached her apartment, the grand penthouse that overlooked the Seine, it was late. The silence of the place greeted her like an old friend, but she wasn't alone. Philippe was waiting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand. His gaze followed her as she entered, his expression concerned. "Long night?" he asked, his tone neutral, but she could hear the unspoken questions behind it. Elena set her purse down and forced a smile. "Business." Philippe rose from the couch, crossing the room toward her. His sharp suit and handsome features were polished, like everything else in their lives. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a warm embrace. But Elena couldn't relax. She had kept so much from him, her past a carefully guarded secret. And now, with Jacques' words hanging over her, she felt the distance between them more acutely than ever. "I was worried," he murmured against her hair. "You've been distant lately." She pulled back, gently placing a hand on his chest. "It's nothing, really. Just some old business I had to take care of." Philippe studied her face, his dark eyes searching for something beneath the surface. He had always been kind, supportive, even when he didn't fully understand her. She had never told him about Jacques or about her past. Philippe only knew her as Elena, the woman he had fallen in love with, not the heiress to a broken empire. "I trust you," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "Just tell me if there's anything you need." Elena smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I will." As Philippe returned to his drink, Elena slipped away to the bathroom. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The makeup was still flawless, but beneath it, she saw the cracks beginning to form. How long could she keep this up? How long before the truth unraveled everything? Turning on the faucet, she splashed cold water on her face, trying to calm the storm inside her. She had always been in control of her image, her career, her plans for revenge. But now, with Jacques' revelation, the carefully constructed walls around her life felt fragile. The next morning, Elena woke with a sense of purpose. She couldn't afford to waste time. If her father's enemies were real, she needed to know who they were and what they wanted. And if she was going to finish what she started, destroying the legacy that Jacques had built, she had to act quickly. Her first step was simple: find out more about the people her father had crossed. She knew Jacques had operated in the murky world of real estate deals, political favors, and under-the-table negotiations. There were bound to be people who hated him, but who were they? And more importantly, how much danger was she in? Elena reached for her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Antoine," she said when he answered, "we need to talk." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Antoine's voice came through, smooth as always. "I was wondering when you'd call. Meet me at the gallery on Rue de Rivoli. 1 hour," she said, her tone brokering no argument. The line went dead, and Elena quickly dressed, slipping into a tailored black dress that was both elegant and imposing. She had learned long ago that appearances could be a weapon just as powerful as any other. Today, she would need every edge she could get. When she arrived at the gallery, Antoine was already there, leaning casually against one of the marble pillars. The place was mostly empty, save for a few tourists admiring the art, which made their meeting feel all the more clandestine. "Elena." Antoine greeted her with a smirk. "You never fail to make an entrance." She ignored his remark and got straight to the point. "My father mentioned enemies. Who are they?" Antoine's expression shifted slightly, the playful arrogance fading as he regarded her with a more serious gaze. "You don't know? If I knew, I wouldn't be asking." Antoine exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair. "Your father made a lot of deals with people who operate in the shadows. Politicians, oligarchs, crime families, you name it, Jacques had ties to them. Some of those deals went sour." Elena crossed her arms, her mind racing. "And now they're after me?" Antoine shrugged. "Possibly. You're the last link to his empire. They might see you as a loose end, or maybe they think you can be useful." "I don't plan on being anyone's pawn," Elena said coldly. Antoine chuckled. "I didn't think you would, but be careful, Elena. These people, when they want something, they take it. And if you get in their way, they'll crush you." Elena's eyes narrowed. "Let them try." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them crackled like electricity. Antoine had always been a dangerous man, loyal to her father, but also looking out for his own interests. She didn't trust him, but right now, he was the closest thing to an ally she had. "I need names," Elena said finally. Antoine raised an eyebrow. "And what will you do with them?" "Find out who's a threat and eliminate them before they eliminate me." There was a brief pause before Antoine pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. "Here. It's a start. But remember, Elena, once you go down this road, there's no turning back." She took the notebook without hesitation, slipping it into her purse. "I was never planning on turning back." As she walked away, her mind was already spinning with possibilities. The notebook was filled with names, each one tied to a piece of her father's corrupt empire. Some were familiar, others were not. But one thing was clear. She would have to navigate a web of danger, deception, and betrayal if she was going to survive and win. Her father's enemies were powerful, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Elena had spent her entire life learning how to fight in the shadows, how to hide in plain sight, and now she was ready to strike. Back in her apartment, Elena opened the notebook and began to study the names. One in particular stood out: Viktor Pavlov, a Russian oligarch known for his ruthless tactics and vast influence. He was one of the most powerful men on the list and one of the most dangerous. It was time to make her first move. Elena stared at Viktor Pavlov's name, scrawled in Antoine's neat handwriting. A Russian oligarch with a reputation for ruthlessness, Pavlov was a key player in the web of corruption her father had woven. If she was going to unravel Jacques Bresson's empire, Pavlov was where she needed to start. The problem was, getting close to a man like Viktor Pavlov wasn't easy. He surrounded himself with layers of protection: bodyguards, politicians, and other powerful figures who owed him favors. But Elena had always been good at finding ways in. After all, she had spent years learning how to navigate the upper echelons of society as an outsider, using charm and beauty to mask her true intentions. She closed the notebook and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, its tone cold and businesslike. "Elena Bresson," the voice said. "I was wondering when you'd call." "I need access to Viktor Pavlov," Elena said, skipping the pleasantries. "I hear you can arrange that." There was a brief pause, followed by a low chuckle. "You don't waste time, do you? Pavlov doesn't meet with just anyone, especially not someone like you." "Then make him want to meet me," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm sure you can come up with something." The man on the other end of the line, Armand Vaux, had been one of the most well-connected fixers in Paris for decades. If anyone could get her close to Pavlov, it was him. Armand had ties to every corrupt politician, criminal, and power broker in the city. He could arrange anything for the right price. "What's in it for me?" Armand asked, his voice smooth but predatory. "I'm sure you've heard about Jacques," Elena said, letting the silence between them stretch just long enough for him to catch on. "Let's just say I'm about to inherit a very large estate. If you help me, I'll make sure you get a piece of it." There was another pause, this one longer. Then Armand spoke again, his tone more serious. "Pavlov is holding a private event this weekend, a gala for his newest real estate venture in Saint-Tropez. It's invitation only, but I can get you in. Once you're there, it's up to you to get his attention." "I'll handle it," Elena said, her voice confident. "Send me the details." The line went dead, and Elena set the phone down with a sigh of relief. The first step was in motion. Now, she had to prepare for the event, and more importantly, figure out how to get Pavlov's attention without raising suspicion. For the next few days, Elena meticulously planned her approach. She studied Pavlov's background, learning everything she could about his business dealings, his social circles, and his weaknesses. Pavlov was a man who prided himself on power and control. He respected strength, and more than anything, he valued loyalty. Loyalty that could be bought or coerced, but loyalty nonetheless. The night of the gala arrived quickly. Elena stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the strap of her elegant silver gown. It was a masterpiece of design, form-fitting but understated, the kind of dress that would make her stand out without drawing too much attention. She had always been skilled at walking the fine line between visible and invisible, knowing exactly when to step into the spotlight and when to blend into the background. Philippe was out of town on business, which suited her just fine. She didn't need him asking questions tonight. As much as she cared for him, there were parts of her life he would never understand, parts she couldn't afford to share with anyone. By the time she arrived at the lavish estate in Saint-Tropez, the gala was already in full swing. The opulent ballroom was filled with some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in Europe, their conversations drifting through the air like soft music. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres to the glittering guests. Elena scanned the room, her gaze sharp but subtle. She spotted Pavlov near the back, surrounded by a small group of men in expensive suits. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his graying hair slicked back, his face hard and unreadable. There was an air of command about him, the kind that made people fall silent when he spoke. She moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging pleasantries with a few familiar faces, careful not to draw too much attention to herself. She was waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to approach Pavlov without it seeming too deliberate. Finally, the chance came. One of the men in Pavlov's group stepped away to take a phone call, and the others dispersed to mingle with the crowd, leaving Pavlov momentarily alone. Elena seized the moment. She picked up a champagne flute from a passing waiter and casually approached him. "Mr. Pavlov?" she said, her voice smooth and confident. "I've been hoping to meet you." Pavlov turned to look at her, his cold blue eyes scanning her from head to toe. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, but it passed quickly. "And you are?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. "Elena Durand?" she said, offering a small smile. "I've been following your work for years. Your investments in real estate are truly impressive." Pavlov raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her boldness. "You know a lot about real estate, Mrs. Durand?" "Let's just say it's in my blood," she replied, holding his gaze. There was a brief pause, then Pavlov smiled, a slow, calculating smile. "I've heard of you. The wife of Philippe Durand, yes?" Elena nodded, her heart beating a little faster. She had his attention, and now she had to keep it. "Philippe speaks highly of you," she said, taking a small sip of her champagne. "He's always admired your business acumen. In fact, we've both been considering expanding our portfolio into Eastern Europe. I was hoping you might have some advice." Pavlov's smile widened slightly, and he gestured for her to sit with him at one of the nearby tables. "Eastern Europe is a complicated market, Mrs. Durand. It's not for the faint of heart." "I'm not faint of heart," Elena replied, her voice steady. Pavlov studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "I can see that. Tell me, what exactly are you looking for in Eastern Europe?" Elena met his gaze, careful to keep her expression neutral. "Opportunities. Philippe and I are always looking for new investments, and I've heard there's a lot of potential in that region, if you know the right people." Pavlov's eyes narrowed slightly, but his tone remained friendly. "And you think I'm one of those people?" "I know you are," Elena said, leaning in just a little. "That's why I wanted to meet you." Pavlov chuckled, clearly amused by her directness. "You're bold, Mrs. Durand. I like that." She smiled, but inside her mind was racing. She needed to steer the conversation in the right direction, but she couldn't push too hard. Pavlov was the kind of man who liked to feel in control, and if she gave away too much too soon, he would become suspicious. "I've always believed that fortune favors the bold," she said, her voice light. Pavlov took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "So, what is it you really want, Mrs. Durand?" Elena hesitated for just a moment, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I want to know more about Jacques Bresson." The shift in Pavlov's demeanor was almost imperceptible, but Elena caught it. His smile faded just a little, and his eyes darkened. "Jacques Bresson was a complicated man," Pavlov said, his voice quieter now. "But I'm not sure what interest you have in him." "He was my father," Elena said, her tone calm but firm, "and I think we have some unfinished business." For a long moment, Pavlov said nothing. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then finally, he leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well then," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "I suppose we do." Elena's heart raced as Viktor Pavlov's smile spread across his face, a smile that spoke of danger and intrigue. She had done it. She had piqued his interest. But now came the real challenge, maintaining his attention without giving away too much. Her mind spun as she calculated her next move, carefully balancing the tension in the air. "Your father and I had history," Pavlov continued, his voice low, like a man recounting a dark memory. "I suppose it's no surprise you've returned to pick up where he left off." Elena smiled coolly, leaning back in her chair with a confidence she didn't quite feel. "I have no intention of following in his footsteps. In fact, I came back to settle old debts, not inherit them." Pavlov raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Debts? Interesting choice of words." Elena didn't flinch. "Let's just say my father's empire wasn't built without stepping on a few throats. I'm here to make sure those debts are paid. And you, Mr. Pavlov, seem to know more than anyone else about who those debts are owed to." Pavlov watched her closely, his blue eyes calculating. Elena could see the wheels turning in his mind, the way he was assessing her every word, every gesture. He wasn't an easy man to fool, and she knew she was walking a thin line between gaining his trust and pushing him too far. "What exactly are you offering, Mrs. Durand?" Pavlov asked, his voice dangerously smooth. Elena took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm offering to settle my father's affairs, cleanly. No loose ends, no more unfinished business. In return, I want information. Information that will help me understand just how deep his dealings went." Pavlov chuckled softly, leaning forward. "And what makes you think I'd be interested in helping you settle your father's debts? I have my own business to attend to." Elena knew she had to play her hand carefully now. Pavlov was a man of power, and men like him didn't help others out of goodwill. They helped because there was something in it for them. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, her voice steady. "I'm asking for an alliance. You know as well as I do that the people my father dealt with don't just disappear because he's gone. They'll come for what's left of his empire, and when they do, they'll come for me. You don't want a war, Mr. B. Pavlov. Neither do I. But if we work together, we can make sure that doesn't happen." Pavlov's smile faded, and for a moment his eyes grew cold. "War is a strong word." "It's not a threat," Elena clarified, her tone calm but firm. "It's a reality. You know who my father dealt with. People who don't forgive, people who don't forget. If they think there's something left to gain, they won't stop until they get it." Pavlov considered her words for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening just slightly. "You're smarter than I expected," he said, his tone grudgingly respectful. "Most people come to me asking for favors, thinking they can buy their way into my good graces. But you're offering something much more valuable." Elena allowed herself a small smile. "I'm offering survival, Mr. Pavlov, yours and mine." Pavlov nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the table as if weighing his options. "You're right about one thing. Your father made enemies, powerful enemies, and they will come for you if they think you're vulnerable." Elena's pulse quickened. "Then we have a deal?" Pavlov held her gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. "We have a deal, but understand this, Elena. If you betray me, if you try to outplay me, you won't live to regret it." Elena met his stare without flinching. "I don't plan on betraying anyone. I just want the truth." Pavlov smirked, clearly amused by her determination. "The truth is a dangerous thing, Elena. But I'll help you. I'll give you the names of the people your father crossed, and in return, you'll ensure that his empire and its enemies don't come knocking at my door." Elena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the break she had been waiting for. Pavlov was the key to unlocking her father's secrets, and now that she had him on her side, she could finally begin to unravel the web Jacques had left behind. "I'll have the information to you soon," Pavlov said, rising from his chair. "But remember, Elena, this is just the beginning. The people we're dealing with, they don't play by the same rules." Elena stood, her gaze steady. "I don't expect them to." Pavlov gave her a final appraising look before turning and walking away, disappearing into the crowd of the gala. Elena watched him go, her mind racing with a mix of excitement and dread. She had gotten what she came for, but at what cost? As she left the gala and stepped out into the cool night air, Elena felt a weight settle on her shoulders. She had entered a dangerous game, one where the stakes were higher than she had anticipated. The names Pavlov would give her weren't just people. They were predators, sharks circling the remnants of her father's empire, waiting for the right moment to strike. Her phone buzzed in her purse. Pulling it out, she saw a message from Antoine. "Be careful, Elena. You're in deeper than you think." She stared at the message for a moment, then slipped the phone back into her bag. Antoine's warning didn't surprise her. She had known from the beginning that this path would be treacherous, but she had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. As she walked through the empty streets of Saint-Tropez, the distant sound of the waves crashing against the shore, Elena thought of her mother. She had vowed to avenge her, to bring down the people who had hurt them both. But now, with the weight of her father's empire pressing down on her, she realized this fight was about more than just revenge. It was about survival. Back at her penthouse in Paris, Elena sat at her vanity, the city lights flickering in the distance. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, the same face she had perfected for years, a mask that hid her true self from the world. But tonight, the mask felt heavier than ever. Pavlov had given her what she needed to start tearing down her father's empire. But the cost of that knowledge was steep, and the enemies she was about to face were far more dangerous than she had anticipated. As she wiped away her makeup, revealing the bare skin beneath, Elena made a silent vow. No matter what it took, she would see this through. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to back down now. She would destroy Jacques Bresson's legacy, and in doing so, she would free herself from the chains of her past. But as she lay in bed that night, her thoughts swirling like a storm, one question lingered in her mind. When the dust settled, would there be anything left of her to save? The early morning light filtered through the curtains of Elena's penthouse, casting a golden glow across the room. She sat at her desk, the notebook Antoine had given her open before her, its pages filled with names, dates, and connections, an intricate web of her father's enemies. Each name carried with it a sense of danger, a shadowy threat looming over her. And at the center of it all was Viktor Pavlov. Elena ran her finger down the list of names, her mind sharp with focus. She had always been meticulous, calculating each move with the precision of a chess master. But this game was more dangerous than anything she had ever played before. The people on this list weren't just businessmen. They were criminals, oligarchs, and power brokers, each more ruthless than the last. She paused at one name in particular, Alexander Ivanov. A former associate of her father's, Ivanov was a Russian arms dealer with a reputation for violence. Elena had heard whispers about him before, stories of men who had crossed him and disappeared without a trace. He was one of the most dangerous men on the list, and according to Antoine's notes, Ivanov had unfinished business with Jacques Bresson. Elena's pulse quickened. If Ivanov was one of the people her father had wronged, then he would surely come for her next. She had to act before he did. But there was another problem, a more personal one. Philippe. Her husband had been blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. He had no idea who Elena really was or what she had been planning for years. But as her involvement with Pavlov deepened and the walls began to close in, she knew it was only a matter of time before Philippe became suspicious. She couldn't risk dragging him into this. He was an innocent bystander in a game of life and death. And yet, she couldn't deny the guilt gnawing at her. Philippe had been nothing but supportive, loving her without question, even when she had hidden so much from him. The thought of what might happen if he learned the truth made her stomach twist. Elena closed the notebook, her decision made. She would confront Ivanov, but first, she needed to ensure Philippe was safe. If her enemies decided to strike, they would use anyone close to her as leverage. She couldn't let that happen. By midday, Elena had arranged a meeting with Ivanov's intermediary, a shady figure named Sergei, who operated out of a nondescript bar on the outskirts of Paris. It was a dangerous move, meeting with someone so closely tied to the underworld, but Elena knew she had no other choice. She needed information, and she needed it fast. The bar was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of cigarette smoke and cheap liquor. Elena stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the worn wooden floor. She had chosen her outfit carefully, dark, understated, yet undeniably elegant. In this world, appearances mattered as much as words, and Elena knew how to wield both. Sergei was waiting for her at a corner table, his expression unreadable beneath the shadows. He was a large man, his presence imposing, but Elena didn't flinch. She had spent her life around men like Sergei, men who believed they held all the power only to find themselves outplayed. Mrs. Durand, Sergei greeted her, his voice thick with a Russian accent. Or should I say, Miss Bresson? Elena slid into the chair across from him, her gaze steady. Elena will do. Sergei smirked, his eyes gleaming with interest. You've made quite the impression meeting with Pavlov. Most people don't get that far. I'm not most people, Elena replied coolly. And I'm not here to waste time. I need to speak with Ivanov. Sergei's smirk widened, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes, something predatory. Ivanov doesn't meet with just anyone. You know that. Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice low and controlled. He'll meet with me. Tell him I'm Jacques Bresson's daughter, and I have information he'll want. There was a tense silence between them, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Finally, Sergei nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I'll arrange a meeting," he said, his tone more serious now. "But be careful, Elena. Ivanov doesn't play games. If you're not careful, you'll end up like your father." Elena met his gaze without blinking. "I'm not afraid of Ivanov." Sergei's smile faded, and for a moment, he studied her with a newfound respect. "Very well. I'll be in touch." Elena stood, giving him a curt nod before turning and walking out of the bar. As she stepped into the cool Parisian air, she felt the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Back at her penthouse, Elena found Philippe sitting in the living room, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening when he saw her. "You're home early," he said, his tone warm. "I thought you had meetings all day." Elena smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I finished early. Thought I'd surprise you." Philippe set down his glass and stood, crossing the room to wrap his arms around her. His embrace was comforting, familiar, and for a moment, Elena allowed herself to relax in his arms. But the guilt was still there, a heavy knot in her chest that wouldn't go away. "I've missed you," Philippe murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You've seemed so distant lately." Elena pulled back slightly, meeting his gaze. This was the moment. She had to protect him, even if it meant pushing him away. "I'm sorry, Philippe," she said softly. "There's something I need to tell you." Philippe frowned, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it?" Elena took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I've been dealing with some things from my past, things I haven't told you about." Philippe's frown deepened, but he didn't interrupt. He simply waited, his eyes searching hers for answers. "My father, Jacques Bresson, he wasn't just a businessman. He was involved in some very dangerous dealings, and now those people are coming after me." Philippe blinked, clearly stunned by her words. "Elena, why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to drag you into it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I wanted to protect you. Now, I don't know if I can." Philippe stared at her for a long moment, his expression a mix of shock and hurt. "Elena, I'm your husband. You should have told me." "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "but it's not safe for you. These people, I don't care about that." Philippe interrupted, his voice firm. "We'll deal with it together. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Elena felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected him to react like this, with unwavering support, despite everything she had hidden from him. "I don't deserve you," she said quietly, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Philippe shook his head, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You deserve more than you know, and we'll get through this. I won't let anyone hurt you." Elena closed her eyes, resting her head against his chest as his words washed over her. But deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning. The storm was coming, and no matter how much Philippe loved her, there were some battles she would have to fight alone. The morning light filtered through the curtains as Elena lay awake, her head resting on Philippe's chest. His slow, steady breathing was the only sound in the room, a peaceful contrast to the storm raging in her mind. She had told him part of the truth, about her father, about the dangerous people circling them, but there was still so much he didn't know. She had kept the darkest parts of her past buried for so long, and now they were clawing their way to the surface. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Philippe. As she moved quietly through the penthouse, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a message from Sergei. "Ivanov is ready to meet. Tonight, don't be late." Elena's stomach tightened. The meeting with Ivanov was her next move, but it was also her most dangerous one yet. If Ivanov suspected anything, if he thought she was trying to manipulate him, the consequences could be fatal. And yet, she couldn't back down now. She needed answers, answers only Ivanov could provide. By the time evening fell, Elena had steeled herself for the encounter. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress and a long coat, her makeup minimal but flawless. She knew how to appear composed, how to project an image of strength, even when she felt like everything around her was unraveling. Tonight, she would need every ounce of that strength. Philippe was in his study when she kissed him goodbye, telling him she had one last meeting before the weekend. He didn't ask questions. He never did. His faith in her was unwavering, and while part of her was grateful, another part was racked with guilt. The deeper she sank into this world of lies and danger, the more she feared that Philippe's trust would be shattered beyond repair. As she left the penthouse and made her way to the rendezvous point, her mind replayed Sergei's words. Ivanov doesn't play games. She had to be prepared for anything. The meeting was set in a secluded, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Paris, a location that made her uneasy. The area was desolate, far from the busy streets and the safety of the city's lights. As Elena's car pulled up to the warehouse, she felt a cold dread creep over her. The shadows seemed to stretch longer here, the silence heavier. Sergei was waiting for her at the entrance, his large frame blocking most of the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but Elena knew better than to trust him. He motioned for her to follow him inside without a word, and she did, her heels clicking softly against the cold concrete floor. Inside, the space was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of dust and rust. At the far end of the warehouse, sitting at a makeshift table surrounded by a few menacing-looking guards, was Alexander Ivanov. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a face etched with lines that spoke of hard living. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto Elena the moment she entered. "Elena Bresson," Ivanov said, his voice carrying a thick Russian accent. "I've heard a lot about you." Elena forced a smile as she approached the table, her pulse quickening. "I've heard a lot about you as well, Mr. Ivanov." He gestured for her to sit, and she did, her posture straight, her gaze steady. Ivanov's guards remained standing, their eyes never leaving her, but Elena ignored them. She had learned long ago not to show fear, even when she felt it gnawing at her insides. "I understand you've inherited quite the mess," Ivanov said, his voice casual but laced with menace. "Your father? He left behind some unfinished business." Elena nodded, keeping her tone calm. "I'm here to settle that business. Whatever debts my father owed, I'm prepared to pay." Ivanov smirked, leaning back in his chair. "It's not that simple, Elena. Your father made promises that weren't kept. That kind of thing. It doesn't just disappear." "What do you want?" she asked, cutting through the tension with a directness that seemed to catch Ivanov off guard. Ivanov's smirk faded slightly, and his gaze hardened. "I want what I'm owed. Jacques Bresson promised me a cut of a major deal, one that never materialized. Instead, he ran off, leaving me with nothing. Now that you're here, you get to make it right." Elena's mind raced. She didn't know the details of the deal Ivanov was talking about, but she could sense the danger in his voice. Her father had left a trail of broken promises behind him, and now those debts had landed on her shoulders. "What was the deal?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ivanov's eyes darkened. "A shipment of arms. Your father was supposed to broker the sale, but he double-crossed me. Took the money and left me high and dry. Now you're going to deliver on that promise." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Arms dealing? This was bigger and darker than she had anticipated. Her father hadn't just been corrupt. He had been involved in illegal, dangerous operations. And now Ivanov was expecting her to step into that world. "I'm not in the arms business, Mr. Ivanov," Elena said, her voice firm but cautious. "But I'm willing to negotiate." Ivanov chuckled, though there was no warmth in it. "Negotiate? You're not in a position to negotiate, Elena. Either you deliver what your father promised, or I'll take it out of your hide." The threat hung in the air like a noose, tightening around her. Elena knew she had to think fast, had to find a way to navigate this without giving Ivanov what he wanted, because if she did, she would be dragged into a world from which there was no escape. "I understand your frustration," Elena said, choosing her words carefully. "But killing me won't get you what you're owed. I can offer you something else, something more valuable than a shipment of arms." Ivanov raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "And what would that be?" Elena leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Access. My father's empire may be crumbling, but I still have connections. I can get you into circles that even he couldn't. Politicians, business leaders, people who can make your problems disappear." There was a long pause as Ivanov considered her offer. The tension in the room was palpable, and Elena could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on her. Finally, Ivanov smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But you'd better be telling the truth, Elena. Because if you're not, you'll end up like your father." Elena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't make promises I can't keep." Ivanov leaned back in his chair, his smile still lingering. "Good. Then we have an understanding. I'll give you a week to start delivering on those promises. Fail, and I won't be so generous next time. Elena rose from her seat, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, but she forced herself to appear calm. You won't be disappointed. As she turned to leave, Ivanov's voice stopped her. And Alina? Be careful who you trust. The people your father crossed, they're closer than you think. Elena didn't respond. She simply walked out of the warehouse, her mind racing. Ivanov had bought her some time, but she knew that his patience would run thin if she didn't produce results. Worse still, his warning echoed in her mind. The people her father had crossed were closing in, and she had no idea who they were. As she stepped back into the night, the cold wind biting at her skin, Elena realized just how precarious her situation had become. The deeper she went, the more dangerous the game became. And now, with Philippe and her own life on the line, she couldn't afford to make a single misstep. But she was determined. She had come too far to turn back now. Whatever it took, she would finish what her father had started and ensure that she didn't become just another casualty of his legacy. The night air was heavy with the weight of Ivanov's threat as Elena drove back into the heart of Paris. The city lights blurred through her windshield, casting fleeting shadows across her face as her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Ivanov's words echoed in her head. The people your father crossed, they're closer than you think. Who could he be talking about? Were they already watching her? Or worse, were they someone close to her, someone she trusted? As her car pulled into the underground garage of her penthouse, Elena's thoughts shifted to Philippe. Her conversation with Ivanov had only solidified what she already knew. Philippe couldn't stay in the dark much longer. If he remained uninvolved, he would be vulnerable, an easy target for her enemies. And she couldn't let that happen. She stepped into the elevator, her fingers brushing the sleek metal panel as she pressed the button for her floor. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirrored walls, her face expressionless, a mask of calm that hid the chaos underneath. As the doors slid open and she stepped into the penthouse, she found Philippe waiting for her in the living room, his eyes filled with concern. "You're home late again?" he said, his voice softer than usual. Elena set her purse down on the marble counter, forcing a small smile. "I had a meeting." "With who?" Philippe asked, standing from the couch and crossing the room to her. His tone was gentle, but there was an edge to it that made Elena's heart tighten. "Just someone tied to my father's old business," she replied carefully. Philippe frowned, clearly unsettled. "Elena, I'm trying to understand what's going on, but you're keeping me in the dark. Who are these people? What business are you really dealing with?" Elena looked away, her chest tightening with guilt. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to tell him everything. The truth was so much darker than Philippe could ever imagine. "Philippe," she began, but her voice faltered. She could feel his eyes on her, searching for the answers she had been hiding for so long. "Elena, talk to me," he urged, taking her hands in his. "I love you, but I can't help you if you won't let me in." His words cut through her like a knife. Philippe had always been her anchor, the one person who had believed in her without question. But now she was pulling him into a world that could destroy them both. She had no choice. He deserved the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. "My father's business wasn't just real estate," Elena admitted, her voice low. "He was involved in arms deals, corrupt politics, and worse. He made powerful enemies, people who want what he left behind. And now they're coming after me." Philippe's expression hardened as the weight of her words sank in. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want to drag you into this," Elena said, her voice trembling. "I thought I could handle it, but now I don't know who to trust. These people are ruthless, and they'll stop at nothing to get what they want." Philippe stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and hurt. "I would have helped you, Elena. I still will. But you can't do this alone." Elena looked away, her throat tight with emotion. "I don't want you to get hurt." "Keeping me in the dark will hurt me more," Philippe replied, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out together. But I need to know everything." Elena took a deep breath, her heart heavy. She had spent so many years keeping her secrets buried, but now they were unraveling before her. She told Philippe about Ivanov, about the arms deal her father had botched, and about the other powerful figures who were waiting in the shadows, ready to strike. As she spoke, she could see the worry etched into Philippe's face, but he listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence between them was thick with tension. Philippe stood, pacing the room as he processed everything she had told him. "So what's the plan?" he asked finally, his voice laced with determination. Elena looked up at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "We can't just sit around and wait for these people to come after you," Philippe said, his tone firm. "If your father left behind enemies, we need to figure out who they are and take control of the situation before they can make a move." Elena blinked, caught off guard by his sudden resolve. She had expected him to be angry, to feel betrayed by her secrets. But instead, Philippe was ready to fight beside her, ready to face the danger head-on. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. "There's one more thing," Elena said, her voice hesitant. "Ivanov warned me that the people who are coming after me might already be closer than I think. I don't know who he was referring to, but I need to figure it out." Philippe frowned, his eyes darkening with concern. "You think someone close to you is involved?" "I don't know," Elena admitted, her mind racing. "But if Ivanov is right, then someone I trust could be working against me." Philippe crossed the room and took her hands in his again, his gaze intense. "We'll figure it out, Elena. We'll find out who's behind this, and we'll make sure they can't hurt you." Elena nodded, her heart pounding. She wasn't used to relying on anyone else, but now, with Philippe standing by her side, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she didn't have to face this alone after all. The next morning, Elena began her search for answers. She knew that if someone close to her was involved, she needed to be careful. Any wrong move could tip them off and put her in even more danger. But she also knew that the clock was ticking. Ivanov's patience wouldn't last forever, and neither would the fragile alliances she had built. She started by revisiting her father's old records, digging through the files and documents she had salvaged after his death. She had avoided looking too closely before, not wanting to confront the full extent of Jacques Bresson's corruption, but now she had no choice. She needed to know everything. As she sifted through the papers, something caught her eye: a series of bank transfers made shortly before her father's death. The amounts were large, suspiciously so, and they were funneled through offshore accounts tied to a shell company she didn't recognize. It didn't take long for her to connect the dots. Someone had been moving money behind the scenes, hiding it from both her father and his enemies. Elena's heart raced as she pieced together the puzzle. Whoever had been siphoning money from Jacques' empire had done so with remarkable precision, staying just under the radar. But now that she knew what to look for, the pattern became clear. One name stood out in the records, a name that made her blood run cold: Antoine Leclerc. Antoine had been her father's right-hand man for years, the one who had cleaned up his messes and made sure the empire ran smoothly. He had been there from the beginning, and Elena had trusted him, at least as much as one could trust someone in her father's world. But now, the evidence was undeniable. Antoine had been playing both sides, siphoning money from Jacques while keeping his own interests hidden. And if Ivanov's warning was true, Antoine was likely the one orchestrating the pressure from the shadows. Elena's chest tightened with a mix of fury and betrayal. Antoine had been playing her, using her father's enemies to position himself for power, and she had walked right into his trap. She grabbed her phone and dialed Sergei's number. "We need to talk," she said as soon as he answered. "It's about Antoine Leclerc." Elena paced the length of her penthouse, her thoughts racing as she waited for Sergei's response. She knew she had uncovered something dangerous. Antoine Leclerc, the man who had been her father's trusted confidant, was at the heart of the betrayal. But now that she had connected the dots, the question remained: how far did this betrayal go? And how much danger was she truly in? Her phone buzzed, cutting through her thoughts. It was a message from Sergei. "Meet me tonight. Usual place." The usual place was the same bar where they had first met, a dingy, low-profile location on the outskirts of Paris. It wasn't ideal, but Elena had no other choice. If Antoine was as dangerous as she suspected, confronting him directly would be a death sentence. She needed to move carefully, and Sergei was the only person who could help her navigate the treacherous waters she now found herself in. As she made her way through the dimly lit streets that evening, the city's usual beauty seemed distant, almost sinister. The bright lights of Paris were mere shadows against the web of betrayal she was now tangled in. She had come so far, but with each step, the game grew deadlier. The bar was nearly empty when Elena arrived. Sergei was seated in a dark corner, his hulking frame making the small table seem even more insignificant. He watched her approach, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Elena," he greeted her with a curt nod as she sat down. "You've been busy." "I've had no choice," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "You were right about my father's enemies, Sergei, but it's worse than I thought." Sergei leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Go on." "It's Antoine," Elena said, her voice low but firm. "He's been siphoning money from my father's empire, playing both sides. And now, he's working with my father's enemies to take everything." Sergei's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe approval. "I thought as much. Antoine has been too quiet for too long. It's not his style to stay in the shadows unless he's got something to gain." Elena felt a surge of anger as she thought about how deeply Antoine's betrayal had cut. He had been there since the beginning, guiding her father's business, free, overseeing everything, and all the while he had been plotting his own rise to power. "I need to know what Antoine is planning," she said, her voice tense. "I need leverage against him, something I can use to turn the tables." Sergei raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her determination. "You're in a dangerous game, Elena. Antoine isn't just after the money. He wants control over everything. If you go after him, you'll need more than just leverage. You'll need an army." "I don't have time to build an army," Elena replied, her eyes flashing with determination. "But I have one thing Antoine doesn't." "And what's that?" Elena leaned in, lowering her voice. "I have Ivanov." Sergei's expression finally changed, his eyes widening slightly. "Ivanov? You made a deal with him?" "I had no choice," Elena admitted. "Ivanov is dangerous, but he's not stupid. He knows Antoine's been playing everyone, and he wants to get back what's his. I'm the only one who can deliver that, and Ivanov knows it." Sergei let out a low chuckle. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that. But you're playing with fire. Ivanov won't care who gets burned as long as he gets what he's owed." "I know," Elena said, her voice steady, "but I'm not planning on giving Ivanov everything. Just enough to keep him on my side until I can deal with Antoine." Sergei nodded slowly, clearly impressed by her resolve. "All right, Elena, I can help you, but you need to be prepared for what's coming. Antoine isn't the type to go down without a fight. If you're going to take him on, you'll have to hit hard and fast." "I'm ready," Elena replied, her gaze unwavering. Sergei reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small flash drive, sliding it across the table to her. "This is what you need. Antoine's been laundering money through a series of shell companies. This drive has the details. It's enough to take him down, but only if you move quickly." Elena picked up the drive, her fingers trembling slightly as she realized the gravity of what she was about to do. This was the key to Antoine's downfall, but it was also the key to her survival. She had to act before Antoine realized she was onto him. "Thank you, Sergei," she said quietly. "I owe you." "You owe me nothing," Sergei replied, his tone gruff but not unkind. "Just make sure you don't get yourself killed." Elena gave him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll do my best." Back at her penthouse, Elena sat at her desk, staring at the flash drive in her hand. Philippe was away on business again, which gave her the space she needed to plan her next move. She plugged the drive into her laptop, her heart pounding as the files began to load. The documents were extensive: financial records, transfers, emails, all tied to Antoine's network of shell companies. It was clear now that he had been skimming from Jacques' empire for years, funneling money into secret accounts and building his own shadow empire. Worse, the files revealed that Antoine had been working with some of Jacques' most dangerous enemies, using them to gain more control. As she scrolled through the records, one name caught her eye: Victor Pavlov. Elena's blood ran cold. Antoine had been dealing with Pavlov behind her back, making secret arrangements that would not only secure his control over her father's empire, but also tie her fate to one of the most dangerous men in Europe. If Pavlov discovered that Elena had been working against him, the consequences would be deadly. Her hands trembled as she closed the files. The stakes had just risen, and Elena realized that she was now caught between two ruthless men: Antoine, who had betrayed her family, and Pavlov, who could crush her with a single word. She had to act fast, but she couldn't do this alone. She needed Philippe. He had always been her anchor, and now, more than ever, she needed his support. When Philippe returned the next evening, Elena was waiting for him. She had rehearsed what she was going to say, how she was going to explain everything. But as soon as he walked through the door, the weight of what she was about to do hit her like a wave. "Elena?" Philippe asked, noticing the tension in the air. "What's going on?" "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight. Philippe frowned, setting his briefcase down and moving toward her. "What's wrong?" Elena took a deep breath, steeling herself. "It's Antoine. He's been betraying me, betraying my father, and he's working with Victor Pavlov." Philippe's eyes widened in shock. "What? How do you know this?" "I have proof," Elena said, showing him the flash drive. "Antoine has been siphoning money for years, setting up deals behind our backs. And now he's trying to take control of everything." Philippe stared at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "How could he do this? He's been with your family for decades." "I don't know," Elena admitted, her voice shaking, "but I have to stop him. If I don't, he'll destroy everything." Philippe was silent for a moment, his expression hardening. "What do we do?" Elena met his gaze, her heart pounding. "We take him down." The room was filled with a tense silence as Elena and Philippe stood together, the weight of their decision settling over them. The flash drive, still plugged into her laptop, was a ticking time bomb, containing all the evidence they needed to bring Antoine down. But the question remained: how? Elena's mind raced with possibilities, but each option felt more dangerous than the last. Antoine was not only deeply embedded in her father's empire, but he was also a master of manipulation. One wrong move, and he would either disappear, leaving her with nothing, or strike back with a vengeance that could destroy her and Philippe. Worse still, Victor Pavlov was involved, and if he caught wind of her plan, her life would be forfeit. "We need to be careful," Elena said, pacing the room. "Antoine isn't just going to let us take him down. He has resources, connections. If he suspects anything, he'll disappear, or worse, he'll use his allies to take us out." Philippe's face was set in a grim expression. "We can't let him get away with this, Elena. He's stolen from you, betrayed your father's legacy, and put both our lives at risk. We need to act fast." Elena nodded, but inside, the anxiety gnawed at her. She had always been careful, always calculated every move. But now, with the stakes higher than ever, she couldn't afford any missteps. "I'll contact Ivanov," Elena said after a long pause. "He needs to know about Antoine's double dealing with Pavlov. That might buy us some time, keep Ivanov from turning on me." Philippe frowned. "You trust Ivanov?" "No," Elena replied quickly. "But I trust his greed. If he finds out Antoine has been cutting side deals with Pavlov, he'll want to settle the score himself. We just need to make sure Ivanov and Pavlov are at odds long enough for us to take Antoine down." Philippe exhaled, rubbing a hand through his hair. "And how do we do that?" Elena turned to her laptop, pulling up the files on Antoine's illicit deals. "We need to expose Antoine publicly. Once the world knows he's been stealing from my father's estate and working with dangerous criminals, his allies will abandon him. He'll be isolated, vulnerable." "And Pavlov?" Elena's stomach churned. "That's where things get tricky. Pavlov will want blood, especially if he thinks I've betrayed him. But if we can make it look like Antoine has been playing both sides, Pavlov might turn on him instead of us." Philippe nodded, though the concern was clear in his eyes. "This is dangerous, Elena. You're playing with fire." "I know," she said quietly, "but I don't have a choice." The next morning, Elena made the call to Ivanov. The conversation was brief, her words carefully chosen. She told him about Antoine's dealings with Pavlov, how he had been double-crossing both sides, and how this betrayal could affect Ivanov's interests. Ivanov, as expected, was furious, but Elena could sense his hesitation. He wasn't a man who acted impulsively. He would bide his time, gather information, and wait for the right moment to strike. It was exactly what she needed. With Ivanov momentarily distracted, Elena and Philippe moved to the next phase of their plan, exposing Antoine. They compiled the evidence, bank records, emails, and secret contracts, and prepared to leak it to the media. Once the story broke, Antoine would be powerless to stop the flood of scrutiny that would come his way. By the end of the day, everything was in place. All that was left was to pull the trigger. That evening, as Elena sat in her living room, her phone buzzed with a notification. The story had gone live. Major news outlets were already picking up the pieces, reporting on the massive financial scandal involving Jacques Bresson's estate. Antoine's name was plastered across every headline. His connections to corrupt politicians and criminal enterprises laid bare for the world to see. Elena watched the chaos unfold from the safety of her penthouse, her heart pounding in her chest. It was done. Antoine was exposed. But as the headline scrolled across her screen, she knew this was only the beginning. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was Ivanov. Elena, Ivanov's voice growled through the phone, thick with anger. "You didn't tell me everything." Elena's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "Pavlov," Ivanov spat. "He knows. He's coming for you." Elena's blood ran cold. "Coming for me? Why? You think you can play both sides, little girl?" Ivanov's voice was laced with venom. "You've put yourself right in the middle of a war. Pavlov doesn't care about Antoine anymore. He wants you." The line went dead before Elena could respond. She stood frozen, her mind racing. How had Pavlov found out? Had Antoine warned him? Or had Pavlov already suspected she was working against him? Philippe entered the room, noticing the look on her face. "What is it?" "It's Pavlov," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He knows. He's coming for me." Philippe's eyes widened in alarm. "We need to leave, now." Elena nodded, grabbing her coat and her bag, but her mind was spinning. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Pavlov was one of the most powerful men in Europe, and if he wanted her dead, there was little she could do to stop him. As they rushed out of the penthouse and into the cold Parisian night, Elena's thoughts turned to Antoine. This was his doing. She was sure of it. He had played his final card, throwing her to the wolves to save himself. But if she survived this, she vowed, she would make him pay for every betrayal. The car sped through the streets of Paris, the city lights blurring into a swirl of colors as they raced toward the airport. Philippe gripped the steering wheel tightly, his face set in grim determination. "We'll go somewhere safe," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "I'll call some contacts, arrange for us to disappear for a while." Elena nodded, though the fear gnawed at her. She had thought she could outsmart them all: Antoine, Ivanov, Pavlov. But now, she was realizing just how deep this game went. The forces arrayed against her were far more powerful than she had anticipated. As the car approached the airport, Elena's phone buzzed again. She hesitated before answering, her heart racing. It was Sergei. "You're in deep trouble, Elena," he said without preamble. "Pavlov's men are already looking for you. You won't make it out of Paris unless you have a plan." "I do," she said, though the words felt hollow. Sergei's silence stretched for a moment before he spoke again. "Listen carefully. There's a private jet waiting for you. It's off the grid, no questions asked. Get there and you'll have a chance. But this is it. Once you're gone, you don't come back." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Where?" Sergei gave her the details and the line went dead. Philippe looked at her, his eyes filled with worry. "What did he say?" "There's a way out," Elena replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But if we take it, we can't ever come back." Philippe's expression softened, and he reached for her hand. "I don't care where we go, Elena, as long as we're together." Elena's heart clenched. She had never expected this, never anticipated that her life would come down to this moment, choosing between revenge and survival, between the past and the future. "I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Philippe squeezed her hand. "We'll make it through this." As the car sped toward the private airstrip, Elena stared out at the dark sky, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She had played the game as best as she could, but in the end, it had swallowed her whole. Now, there was only one thing left to do: escape. The plane was waiting when they arrived, its engines humming quietly in the night. Elena and Philippe boarded quickly, their footsteps echoing in the silence. As the doors closed behind them and the plane began to taxi down the runway, Elena felt the crushing weight of the past lift, if only slightly. They were leaving it all behind. But as As the plane soared into the dark sky, Alina couldn't shake the feeling that the game wasn't over. Antoine, Ivanov, Pavlov, they were still out there, still playing their own hands. And she knew, deep down, that one day she might have to face them again. For now, though, she was free. And that was enough. I hope you enjoyed the conclusion to the story. Let me know if you'd like any changes or adjustments.